Behold, the mighty Super Victor for 455 Oldsmobile. It's a big bastard. I would say that is probably the best intake manifold made for a big Olds engine. If you're going for max power, it's one. Expensive as hell. That big bastard will flow. Pretty good sized plum in there. This is a 4150 holly pattern. They also come in a Dominator pattern. Good straight shot at them runners. Long ass runners. Oldsmobiles are torque monsters anyway. And long ass runners will enhance the torque production. Plus these things will pull on out as high RPM as you're bold enough to take one. I've had big Olds engines out to 6,800 to 7 grand back in the day. Had a 425 that I'd take to 7,200. 66 425, but it had a pretty good build on it. Had some good shit going on. I used to be into Oldsmobile engines pretty hard and heavy for a while. I went a good 10 or 15 years obsessed with them, which I still like them. They're just so fucking expensive to build. You can build 2 big block Chevys for the price of one big Oldsmobile. You can make big power with these fucking things, but you're gonna have to work for it. They're not a big block Chevy. But nonetheless, people have been making big power with Oldsmobile engines for a long time. There's people who ran Olds engines in Pro Stock back in the late 70s, early 80s. You find Pro Stock Oldsmobile engines and be competitive. You know, they wasn't just fucking around. They were winning races, and you know, they were serious contenders. But it just take more effort to make an Olds engine compete with the big Chevys and Mopars and Fords and shit. But it can be done. And Superstock, stock. I built a lot of Olds engines back in the day. I built an NHRA legal stock 350 Olds and a 455. And some Chevys, but that's a story for another day. But back in the day, I grew up around drag strips and drag racing and shit, and a lot of stock, super stock, modified production. Those type cars were what I was exposed to the most. So that shit kind of stuck on me. Back in the day, even back in the 80s, a guy could, if he's a mechanic or a truck driver or fucking, whatever, machinist, welder, whatever your occupation may be, blue collar guys, if you wanted to build you a drag car, get you an NHRA rule book, you find a fucking class you feel like you can stand a chance in and compete, build your car around it, go out there and give it your all. Them other guys in them fucking classes, they weren't superhuman motherfuckers, they were just men just like you and me. So if they could do it, you could do it. But most people were on a level playing field back then, and it wasn't a money fucking game like it is now. Nowadays, if you want to go try to compete NHRA Superstock, you better own a successful car dealership. You better be a CEO of a big company making shitloads of money with lots of disposable time. You better be raking in serious fucking dough, because shit has changed, and the common man, there's no way in hell you could afford to go build a Superstock A or B or C car and try to compete at the highest level. It's, you're competing against fucking Budweiser money and shit. And if you're just a guy working as a mechanic somewhere or working in a fucking machine shop boring blocks and shit, you can't compete with Budweiser. They got all the money and the best of every fucking thing. They have Patterson supplying their engines and shit. So it's out of reach for the common man anymore, but I still like that kind of shit. But it's just, in modern times, the money shit's gotten way out of control, and it just fucks it up for everybody but a handful of people that can afford to do it. But I still like those type of engines and cars, and a person could build an old school type Superstocker, built like one would be built in the 70s or 80s, and set it up for no prep racing or bracket racing or whatever the fuck you want to do, street racing, whatever you want to do with it. You build you a 80s Superstocker and take it out on the street, you're gonna smoke a lot of ass with it. The rules, back in the day, your typical Superstock rules were you had to run no more than like 60 overbore. You had to have stock type pistons. They could be forged and lightweight and set up for floating pins, but they had to have the same type dome as what the engine came with. So you had to deck the shit out of the block and mill the heads and run a thin ass gasket to get your compression up. But you could run any cam, any valve train that you could make work in the engine. So if you could stuff a 900 lift cam in that motherfucker, there wasn't nobody saying you couldn't. And a friend of mine still races Superstock, and he runs Super Duty 455 Pontiac engines, and he runs about a 950 lift solid roller in that fucking engine with a quarter jet. and it runs low nines at about 150 in the quarter, and it's a legal 73 Super Duty 455 Superstock engine. It's in an 87 Trans Am. It's a SSGT A car, but it's a bad motherfucker. But you gotta run production heads, and they gotta have the same CC as what they came with. So I think his fucking Super Duty Pontiac came with like a 185cc runner head, and that's what they, they're legal, that's what they measure. But the fucking runner's been raised up a half an inch. There's a half inch of epoxy in the bottom of the runner, and the top of it's raised all the way to the valve cover rail. There's shitload of work in them heads, and they're 185cc runners, but that engine makes about 725 horsepower on a dyno with a 800 quarter jet, the one that came on the engine brand new. Runs low fucking nines, standing on the bumper every time it takes off. So it ain't just fucking around. But you gotta run the production based heads, but you can do anything you want to them long as they measure out with the proper CCs and shit. And then you got your minimum chamber size allowed, and then you got your minimums and maximums all the way through the engine. So it's gotta be legal. If you have to tear it down, they check everything. But you can run any intake manifold that would fit the engine, as long as it would fit under the hood. Back in the day, I don't know about today's rules, because I ain't been around the shit in a long time. But back in the day, you had to have stock fucking hood, and if it didn't fit under the hood, it wasn't legal. So most people just run a carburetor with a bottom pan, a base of an air cleaner with no air cleaner. Chop the bracing and shit out underneath the hood. But you had to run the stock carburetor that came on the engine. If your engine came new with a quarter jet, that's what kind of carburetor, that you had to have the same quarter jet that it was originally equipped with. So pretty much Superstock engines are all cam and valve train and intake and head work, but everything else was pretty well limited. I mean, you could have aftermarket rods and shit, but they couldn't be, Bill Miller aluminum rods or no shit like that. They had to weigh within so many grams of a stock rod, shit like that. But it was always cool to see people doing the most with the least. Anybody can crack open a Jegs catalog and buy the trick, the latest trick of the fucking week. But stock, super stock, you had to get creative with that shit. It really was stock. I always liked stock class because you were basically limited to most of the shit the engine came with. But in an NHRA stock engine, most of your power is coming from your cam. You gotta have stock lift, but other than that, anything goes. And them NHRA stock engines have weird ass cams, like a particular 305, I think it had like 390 intake, 410 exhaust lift, but it was like 104 lobe separation, 268, 278 at 50, shitload of advertised duration. It was a radical cam with stock lift. That fucking engine didn't sound stock. Didn't run stock either. Ran 1160s in a Malibu wagon with a cast iron intake and number 416 cast iron heads. Fucking quadrajet. But there's a lot of magic in that shit. There's some shit might not add a couple of horsepower, but a couple of horsepower in 50 places is 100 horsepower. So you just gotta find them couple of horsepower everywhere you can. And when you're limited to mostly stock parts, you gotta get creative. And even sometimes find the loopholes in the rules and shit, and find what they don't say you can't do, but you just gotta be more creative with that shit. It's a lot more to it than just getting out a catalog and or getting on the fucking internet and listening to what everybody else is buying and copycat, buy the same fucking AFR heads and this cam and that intake and this fuel injection system, and a whole lot of Me Too motherfuckers out there these days. LS swap it. But not everybody's into that shit. Some people like to relive their youth, and their taste reflects what was cool when they were young. And when I was young, this kind of shit was cool. Stock, Superstock, modified production, all your door slammer class, pro gas, door slammer cars that hauled ass. Even your old pro stockers and shit back in the day, back in the early 70s, you didn't have to be a millionaire to build a pro stocker either, but that shit got out of hand real quick. By the mid-70s rolled around, it was high dollar professional class. You had to have mega bucks to compete with the Bob Gliddens and the Rouses and the Grumpy Jenkins and Dick Landys and Sox and Martin. Not many people could afford to compete with them guys, especially when most of them had factory backing, like Chrysler and shit, paying the bill. Guy working in a fucking garage somewhere as a mechanic can't afford to compete with Chrysler. But that's the way shit goes. Everything always gets too expensive, and the common man gets pushed right the fuck out. But man can still have fun with this shit and still build engines and use them for whatever the fuck you want to use them for. This particular intake here, I'm going to I have a collection of Oldsmobile engines still tucked away. I'm going to build me a 455 Oldsmobile. I want to run 9s in the quarter NA with a single 4-barrel 455 Olds. And this is going to be the fucking intake I'm going to do it with. And I want to build a Superstock type 455, but with no rules. But it's going to be a vintage Superstocker type, like you would see like in the early 80s, mid 80s, except this intake didn't exist back then. Last time I built an Oldsmobile engine, this intake didn't exist. You had your Offenhauser Supersonic, you had your Edelbrock Torquer, and they made a Holly strip dominator for these things, but they were pretty rare. They were rare back in the day. They're really rare now. So back in the day, I ran the Offenhausers and the Edelbrock Torquers on them. This intake here, I believe they came out 10 or 15 years ago. I ain't built an Olds engine in about 20 years, and it didn't exist back then, or I would have done had one. But I think this thing will get a 455 acting right, which I have. I think I have 7 455s. I have 2 425s. I have a 403. I have a 330 and a 350 Oldsmobile engines. So I might build a fucking them 425s. They really come to life. They actually, with the shorter stroke and shit, I have 455s and 425s, and 425s, they just seem to rev a little quicker and shit. You turn them up. They come with forged steel cranks, where almost all your 455s came with cast cranks, but they were nodular iron cranks. They were pretty damn tough, actually. It'd be hard to break a stock 455 crank. But them old 425s had a forged crank in them, and there was people building top fuel dragster engines with 425s back in the mid 60s, and them fucking stock cranks were handling, they were cranked up 1500 horsepower or better on nitromethane, big fucking blower on them and shit. And them crankshafts were holding up to that abuse, so they're tough. But I might put this shit on a 425. I'm gonna put a giant fucking cam in it, somewhere in the 750 to 800 lift range. I'll try a few carburetors on it. I might see how fast I can go with a Superstock quater jet. I'll put a Dominator on it. And probably try 950 HP I have in stock. Just run them all and compare them. But I want to build it like a Superstock engine from back in the day. So I might end up running a quater jet on that bastard. But it's gonna have a hell of a cam in it. And I might go with modern aluminum heads, which there ain't many choices for Oldsmobiles. So you want to get real serious, you're gonna have to port the fuck out of about any head you can get for them. But shit, them old You take an old pair of C castings from the late 60s, port the shit out of them, and get a lot more flow out of them than one would believe. They flowed pretty damn good stock, actually. I think they were, I've seen flow numbers on C heads. It seemed like they were in the 260-ish range in stock form. So a person could pretty good with a grinder. You get them out over 300 pretty fucking easy. Put bigger valves in them and shit. Port the hell out of them. The exhaust center divider, either weld it up or you can mill it off till it's flush. Because the center two ports, the divider is slightly recessed on the stock heads. You want to get that up even with the rest of the fucking header flange. There's a lot of tricks you can do to these fucking things, and they will run. I've run mid-10s with 455 Oldsmobiles back in the day, and they wasn't, they were more simple than one would think. They definitely have potential. I just got out of them because they got so fucking expensive to build, and the parts availability is pretty fucking slim. I got into the old Chevrolets because you can find shit for them everywhere and cheaper than anything else, and there's no denying the potential of a big block Chevy engine. They pretty well stomp the ass of about any other engine made if properly built, so including these Oldsmobiles. Much as I hate to say it, but facts are facts. I love my Oldsmobiles, but when I did fuck with them back in the day, if I got my ass handed to me, it was usually a big block Chevy that did it. So that kind of, if you can't beat them, join them. I fucked with Pontiacs for years. Had some fast ponchos back in the day, but it's hard to compete with them big Chevys. And every fucking thing's made for them, and the heads on them, they're just hard to fucking beat. Even the shittiest big block Chevy heads still have enough flow to support 500 plus horsepower pretty easy. And that's the shitty heads. The good heads, which stock rectangle port big block Chevy heads, they'll support 680, 690 horsepower before they become a choke. But that's more than most shit will. These old Pontiacs and Oldsmobiles and shit, they still have their place. And they'll always be cool in my book. Different. Everybody and their brother screaming fucking LS swap the world and shit. And that shit's played out in my world. I worked on a hell of a lot of LS engines and I wasn't impressed. Just another engine. But those who don't know what they don't know, they don't know. And there's a hell of a lot more options out there than an LS. But these old antique fuckers, they got potential. They just gonna cost you some money. But there it is, Super Victor 455 Olds.